Hello, Ken. It's so good to connect with you again. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure, as always.
I still vividly remember how we came to know each other. Can you believe it's over 6 years now?
It's hard to believe.
And I'm not sure if I ever shared this with you before. It's almost since the mid 90s, as an engineer trying to build something, right? We all try to build something solid. I've been kind of reading so much on so many disciplines and integrating a bunch of little ideas from areas like systems thinking, neuroscience, and behavioral economics to come up with more effective ways, not only to understand problems better, but also to come up with long term solutions that stand the test of time and not just patchwork, band aid solutions, right? And during that process, one of my advisors is the one who told me that a lot of my work in making wiser choices was in the realm of social psychology. And that's when I began Googling for the top schools and found that Ohio State and Michigan tied for the first place in US News and World Report. Since Columbus was closer to me, I looked up your department and was fascinated to see a program of all things in decision psychology. That's when I started reading the bios and the interests of the faculty, and I was excited to find that you and I were so aligned in our pursuits. And I have to say, Ken, I'm still extremely grateful that you responded to my cold email over your Christmas break.
it's,
Fact,
it's been
five days.
fun.
Yeah, in fact, 5 days ahead of the date that your autoresponder said you'll try to respond in a timely manner. I mean, I've never heard anybody respond in a timely manner. You were ahead of schedule. So, my question to you is I really wanted to get your take on what prompted you folks at Ohio State to create a multidisciplinary program in decision psychology?
A lot of my understanding is that a lot of these processes occurred prior to my arrival in 2006. The way that I've heard the story told is that the, the university was interested, or at least the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences at the time was interested in promoting multidisciplinary science, particularly in domains where they had existing strengths, and they wanted to basically use that as an opportunity for targeted investment.
Hmm.
Um, and they kind of did a survey of, and I'm not sure exactly the methodology, but they kind of surveyed folks and said, like, what are we really good at? And they weren't anticipating it, but they discovered that decision-making researchers across at least across the College of Behavioral, Social and Behavioral Sciences, were really well respected in their domains, but they weren't really that well connected. And so there was an initiative to basically formalize this, try to bring these people together and really build on an existing strength. And so that's what they started to do. They created what is now referred to as the Decision Sciences Collaborative. I was not actually hired as part of this initial group. They didn't actually realize I was brought in as a social psychologist, not as a decision-making researcher. But when they discovered that I had decision-making leanings, they quickly folded me into the program. And then we made an additional series of targeted hires in psychology, but as well as in other disciplines, with a little extra money from the university to supplement the funds that the department had. They were able to basically expand the pie and hire additional faculty in each department. And we continue to receive funding from the university, a small pot, but it brings us together for an annual conference. We celebrate, we have every one of these conferences has a couple of what we might refer to as elevator introduction talks, where faculty give a 5-minute spiel about what they do. We also celebrate graduate student research. And just having exposure to each other's research, we're better able to create connections. We also have a small grant writing competition twice a year. And again, it serves for exposure, but it also targets decision-making as part of the university's ventures, with the idea that we're investing in young people to get larger grants later. And so far it seems very successful, and many of us are working together, and I've met people that I normally would not have met otherwise through this program, and it's been really great.
Wow. So what kind of fruits? I mean, obviously, I'm a big believer in it in terms of multidisciplinary work, but I'm curious from your perspective, what have you seen as the result of this collaborative?
Well, one is just a focus on how important the issue is. So, as I said, I have a foot in each in social psychology and a foot in decision psych, and we all have our homes,
Mm-hmm.
and so it's easier to think about what's the next research question, what's the next research idea in one's own home. But exposure to decision psych has allowed me to say, oh, my work has relevance in this domain and this domain. So it kind of opens me up to new possibilities. It also allows us to create more interesting teams to tackle problems.
Mm.
So for example, I'm now collaborating with some folks who are also in the psych department, but take such a very different approach. The one person I'm thinking about is Ian Krivik, who is a behavioral economist. And we're working together on some projects that I don't know we would have started without these structural connections in the first place. The program made it easy for us to work together, incentivized it. And so we are now working together on some projects that I'm really excited about. The decision psych program also allows us to connect to other folks in the university who are exploring decision making, even if they're not directly tied to the initiative.
Mm.
We've expanded the initiative, though, so it now includes colleges beyond social and behavioral sciences. So one colleague of mine is Robin Wilson. She works in the School of Environmental and Natural Resources. And we have just begun a project about a month ago, trying to see whether we can promote more sustainable decision making. So can we get farmers to make decisions that put conservation over profit, or perhaps maximize both, that are sensitive to both conservation and profit, and trying to create and think about potential interventions. So I would never have learned anything about farming and know that these are actually problems, serious problems that our country faces, had it not been through the connections I created through the Decision
Wow.
Sciences Collaborative.
That was a lot of good stuff. Actually, I think you touched two huge areas, one, especially with farming. But the interesting thing I found in the last comment you made was the or switch to the and, right? Because most of the time when problems are presented, can we change someone's mind to think about sustainability over profit, as opposed to why can't we maximize both for
Yep,
the long term?
agreed.
Because that's the key, right? I mean, the oldest story I know is um, the guy who killed the golden goose, right? Because he wanted all the golden eggs in one shot.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of thinking is, while it's a fable, it's so prevalent even today. And this might get more into the kind of work. But before we jump into your specific interests, what types of problems, as a result of this collaborative, obviously you talked about farming, you talked about, and you mentioned the other exciting project, but you didn't mention what topic it's on. What are some of the real, as you say, huge problems that our world, not just our country, faces, that as a result of these kind of cross connections, you're able to tackle now?
Well, so in my first project with Ian Krivik, we are interested in a core question that my lab is really interested in, which is why people fail at self-control. So
Mm.
why do people set these lofty goals for themselves and then make decisions that undermine them and undercut them? So classic instance would be a smoker who says, I will quit, but then continues to smoke, or a dieter who says, I will diet, but then at every opportunity chooses to indulge. And the problems of self-control are implicated in lots of problems in the world. Anything that involves myopic decision-making is usually implicated in self-control, including financial decisions, health decisions. We can even think about corporations that engage in short-term thinking as opposed to more long-term thinking, governments, policies. So these are often the source of a lot of irrational decisions that people come to that they later regret. And so the
Yes.
question is whether we can prevent that from occurring in the first place, or
That's
from undermining the progress that they have made.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, it's funny you mentioned the word regret. There's a lot of talk about happiness, and for me, happiness is a fuzzy concept. It may be there, may not be there, but I feel like regret and anxiety are very palpable.
Hmm.
So for me, I mean,
Hmm.
very palpable, right? Regret is something we feel, anxiety we feel. Any moment you say, how anxious are you, or what kind of regret are you, what
Hmm.
are you regretting? I think you will get precise answers
Hmm.
as to, are you happy today?
Hmm.
And so my goal is to keep my regret level and my anxiety level low. And if that happens, I'm having a good life.
Well, there is a difference between happiness and positive well-being, and it's not my area of expertise, but I do know that people make that differentiation, and I think they're often conflated. Um, I, it, it I think the function of some emotions like anxiety and regret are specifically to focus us on certain issues. So there's some research to suggest that anxiety is designed to cue us to stop because there's something wrong.
Mhm.
And there's also research as well, regret is supposed to be a functional emotion that helps us reconsider our previous actions so we don't make those mistakes again. But I think it's really interesting about self-control is that we feel the regret, but then we keep making the same decisions again and again and again and again. So we don't seem to learn very effectively from our past mistakes, or there's something about the decision-making situation itself that prompts us to not think about the previous regret that we've had.
Wow. In fact, I've always enjoyed the line in your bio which says, why, despite possessing remarkable intelligence and reasoning capacity, people often make decisions and behave in ways that undermine their valued goals and objectives. And this has been something that's occupied many years of my own work. And I know we've had so many conversations about this, but to capture it and share it with our friends as we're doing, can you tell me what the top reasons why people succumb to this behavior?
In my work and in my colleagues' work, we suggest that people have different mindsets or different ways of thinking when they are removed from the situation versus when they're in the heat of the moment, right? So when I'm trying to decide what my New Year's resolution is going to be and I say I'm going to lose weight, I'm in one mindset. But when I'm actually presented with my favorite food that's fattening that I really shouldn't be eating, right? I'm in a completely different mindset. And these shifts in mindset, and we refer to these as construals, these shifts in mindset are the reason why these mindsets engage in different calculations. And these are the reasons why we come to different decisions at different moments. The problem, of course, is we're in one mindset when the situation is removed. We're in another mindset in the heat of the moment. And then after we make our decision, we're back in the removed mindset and wondering who was that person making that decision and why did they make that decision? And so what we are trying to do is find greater correspondence or greater consistency of the mindset across these different situations. And what we're trying to do is find different ways to make this instantiate that, and then also to try to understand what is it about the situation, the hot situation, that so causes us to forget all these other things that we were worried about.
Wow. So these two viewpoints, I mean, even when you deal with emotional issues, one of the things I used to tell ago was, why don't you become a reporter and report the incident on television, you know? And when you do that, you automatically take a removed perspective on it, and the whole drama kind of goes down because you're now reporting on the incident rather than living the incident.
Indeed.
Is that something similar to what you're talking about? Or
Absolutely. And in fact, there is research to support that claim. My colleagues, Ethan Cross and Islam Iduk, do a lot of research on what they refer to as self-distancing. So if you
Hmm.
refer to yourself from the third person perspective, or you look at the scene as if you're observer rather than the actor, you can create shifts in the mindset that make you more consistent with the removed as opposed to immersed person.
So does that play into self-control as well?
We think that's fundamental. So we think these different perspectives are creating changes into these mindsets. So if I, for example, think of myself in the third person as opposed to the first person in the heat of the moment,
Hmm.
I'm able to remove myself and adopt more of the mindset that I had when the situation was far away, as opposed to what it's like when I was immersed. By basically recreating or resimulating the mindset that I had when the temptation was really far away, I have greater clarity as to what I wanted when it was back then, and then make choices that I'm less likely to regret in the future.
That's interesting. So this probably goes with when people say, "What would?" I mean, I've heard this. What would Jesus do, or what
Mm-hmm.
would a wiser Krishna do, right?
Yep.
As opposed to what the normal, regular, everyday Krishna does versus everyday Ken versus the wiser Ken. Is that something? Is that a good habit to develop where first, obviously, we got to recognize that it is happening, and then do the proverbial pause so that you interrupt the automatic reaction, and then probably ask yourself, what would the other person do, the wiser side? Is that?
Indeed. So you've actually spotlighted two critical processes that are involved. The first is to recognize that this is a problem, that this situation is a problem for my goals and my values, which is actually a very difficult problem.
Mm.
The second one is how to resolve that. So once I know this is problematic, how do I overcome the problem in a way that is good for me?
Mm-hmm.
With respect to the second one, it's interesting that you asked the question, what would Jesus do or what would the wiser Krishna do? Because there is research with kids that their ability to delay gratification increases if they simulate the role of a hero. So in this one experiment that they did, they either said, do you want the two marshmallows, the one marshmallow now or the two marshmallows later as yourself? Or they put a cape on the children and said, what would Batman do? And the what would Batman do conditions, the kids were able to wait much longer than when they were just making the decision for themselves. So I think there is a lot of value in this strategy of asking, what would somebody else do, especially if it's someone I aspire to be like. And again, I think it pulls you out of yourself, helps you adopt the perspective of someone else, and therefore have what my research would suggest, a more global or big picture perspective on the decision. The tricky thing, though, is knowing that I have to use the strategy, and it can often be very difficult in here and now. And so that's a question I think we have to really tackle next. In my research, we actually have shown that this global thinking not only helps us resolve the problem, but also helps us identify that it's problematic in the first place.
Oh,
In other words, if I'm hungry and I see some indulgent food, the most sensible thing to do is to eat those foods. Unless, of course, you remember that you're on a diet, right? And so bringing that diet mindset to bear is what's really tricky. My research suggests that people who are good at self-control, they have created these habits whereby when they encounter temptations, they're already sort of engaging more in this big picture perspective. So learning how to do this on cue is sort of the trick to successful self-control.
that's beautifully said, on cue. In fact, when I do my workshops, I refer to identify the trigger.
Exactly.
The trigger is really, in the example you just discussed, Ken, is really noticing you're hungry.
Yes.
That's the trigger, because once you're in that state, using your mind state, hungry state means there is a chance you're going to succumb, right? The moment hunger starts. So the moment hunger starts, you got to bring in your guardrails in place so that you don't violate your own commitments, right?
Indeed. And research suggests that the more you can do this work proactively prior to the exposure to the trigger, the better off you will be. In other words, if you are more reactive and you wait till the critical situation, you have nothing to help you. Whereas if you, first of all, use, when temptations or triggers are far away, if you can identify them as well as identify how you're going to respond to them and make appropriate plans in advance, you're much more likely when you encounter that situation to actually be able to take charge and hold yourself back. I think the problem is most of us, that's not what we think of when we think of self-control. We think of self-control as something that you do after the trigger. And that's already too late. The train has already left the station.
Right.
And so my colleagues and I have argued that what you really have to do is nip the problem before it buds, right? So really get at it before it becomes something big.
So Ken, I think also right now there might be some nomenclature issues. So I just want to clarify. Sure. So so let's take the hunger situation. So I'm sitting here in my office talking to you, and it's going to be lunchtimes, or it is lunchtime, and I'm beginning to feel hungry, right? And I notice that I'm feeling hungry. So the temptation, I haven't seen the bad indulgent food yet, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's not visible to me right now, but I recognize I'm getting hungry. And as soon as we're done, I'll probably go get something to eat. So would that be considered the trigger, or to notice the fact that I'm hungry, and therefore I can then apply what I refer to as the preloaded response? So what will I do when I'm hungry if I want to be on a diet? I load that response now that I'm feeling hungry before I see the awesome food options? How would you, so where is the trigger in your nomenclature? Is the feeling of hunger the trigger, or is the seeing of the indulgent food the trigger?
For me, it would be the combination of the hunger and the food, right? So it's the hunger sets the stage. The food is what actually makes everything go bad. So in taking proactive strategies, you could either say something like, don't have that food in the house, or
Mhm.
you could take two steps back and say, be wary when you're hungry. And I think a successful, effective decision maker will kind of take into account all of those, right?
Right.
Have more proximal strategies, have more distal strategies. And we talk about this as having a toolbox of
Mhm.
strategies. So it's, you don't just want to focus on one.
Got it.
In order, in order to really stick to our goals and to really make sure our decisions align with these goals, we have to make it as easy as we can, and we have to take advantage of every tool that we have available. And humans have evolved lots of different psychological tools to help us. And I think you've already articulated two of them, which is one, don't ever, don't have the temptations in your house. Two, don't get in a situation where you will be tempted. And then you can think of other strategies as well.
Got it. Thank you. You see the thing you mentioned, which is be wary when you're hungry. Does that really work?
I actually think it does,
Okay.
because I come from a motivational perspective.
Mm-mm.
And one of the things that we know about motivation is that if they are unmet, they keep growing in strength.
Mm.
So hunger is a great example, because if you do not meet your hunger needs, you get hungrier and hungrier, and things that you normally wouldn't consider food become more open to the category of food. So I normally might not consider, eating this particularly indulgent food, but as I get hungrier and hungrier, it looks better and better.
Mm.
So from a motivational perspective, you also want to, in addition to preventing yourself from being exposed to those foods and whatever else, what other temptations might be there, a key part of making good decision is regulating and controlling the motivations that lead you down the wrong road. Finding healthy ways to express that, right? So having a snack as opposed to waiting and waiting and waiting and then having this crazy episode. And it doesn't apply just to food. It also applies to um, social motivations. If I have a need to be respected by others, for example, you want to find healthy ways to satisfy that motivation, so that it doesn't become some ugly scene when it hasn't been met for a long time and you feel disrespected and whatnot, and it becomes this big dramatic event. If you can find smaller ways to sort of let some steam out, right, to keep the pressure from building, you're
Mm.
much more likely to make the kinds of decisions that you'd be happy with.
That's almost like having cookie crumbs to the final
Yes.
action. Interesting, you brought that second example as well. But going back to the hunger one, I think you said something very interesting, which was so for example, right now, I have no snacks anywhere near me, healthy snacks, let's call it that. Ideally, I know every day I get hungry and I don't have food near me, especially healthy options, which means if this call were to continue for another hour, which it will not, then the chances of me being extremely hungry, and then walking upstairs and grabbing anything in sight becomes more possible, right?
Mm-hmm.
So having that healthy snack visible in your environment. So the environment, how you set it up, I know for people who struggle with exercise like myself, keeping the shoes near the bed is a good indicator that it's an environmental cue for
Yes.
you to do something. And it's kind of interesting if that you are bringing that into this conversation as well as we were talking.
Yes, I mean, I think all of these strategies that you're mentioning make the right decision easier. And I think that really is the key to self-control. I think many of us have this image that self-control is about strength. It's about willpower. It's about being tough. And that's not actually what research suggests. Research suggests, and this is actually the title of an article that Ethan Cross and I recently published with Ariana Orva, one of his students. The secret to self-control is by being smarter, not by working harder. Um, it's
Hmm.
about being strategic and thoughtful about how you're going to structure your environment, how you're going to be thoughtful about having a plan in place to protect what's really important from you, from all the myriad of other things that we could potentially do. And the world presents us with lots of opportunities to engage in lots of different things. And so prioritizing the motivations that are really important to us is really difficult. And again, we're talking about things like food and smoking, but you could also think about this in terms of, and these are questions that I know you're interested in, Krishna, like work-life balance. How do I make sure I stop going down this road? Or how do I make sure how do I make sure that I don't have this negative interaction with this person? Or how do I make sure that I don't get completely caught up in this other thing that prevents me from worrying about other? These are all involved in daily decisions that we make and regret. And because life presents us with so many opportunities, prioritizing the motivations that are really important to us becomes really key. But that can be really difficult, as I've mentioned, in the heat of the moment. And so the more you can do when you're sort of removed, the easier it is to make the right decisions in the heat of the moment. But if you try to recreate those moments of clarity in the here and now, that becomes very difficult.
Got it. It's funny you brought about structure of the environment. Recently, I discovered this. Even though I do work in this space, I was completely blind to it. What happened was I stopped writing. It's been over a year since I've written, or almost a year since I've written something. And I did all kinds of things, brought myself to look at what I got. I bought this, eat, sleep, write. Nothing has been working, even though I have physical cues and so on, until I realized that the problem was my desk. So once we got into the Zoom world or virtual world in last March, I needed to raise the computer to a higher level so that I could see the person and not be looking at, when you have a Zoom call where people are talking like this and the camera is elsewhere, it's very awkward. There's zero eye contact, right? So I I got a table which was really the size of my laptop and which had a leg that I could raise the height. And I raised it to match the eye level of the camera so that I could look into the camera and look at the other person, right, who shows up on the monitor. And so this was the way I had to write. How cool is it to write like, how long do you think you can type in this posture? And that's what happened. That was one, sorry. And there's multiple contributors. Second one was, in the past, my screen time was writing time. So if I spent 3 hours in front of a computer, that was to do email, write, and read some things on the web. Now, your 3 hours are on Zoom. So I realized that my screen time that I'd allocated was already used up in Zoom or a virtual call. So I don't want to be sitting in front of a computer. So I once I realized the screen time issue, I fixed that. But I still didn't realize that it was this uncomfortable position to write was what was keeping me away from writing. But I never connected those two dots till I got this height adjusting desk. Now I have 3 heights. One is writing height, one is Zoom call height, and the third one is to stand up and present. So 3 heights of a simple desk has completely changed my attitude towards writing. I mean, I was really staying away from writing, but at the same time, with all the intentions to write, I just haven't been able to write for the last year. And I just started writing today, as a matter of fact, after I just got the desk over the weekend. Any coincidences here, or is there some research that you have done that can actually point to what just happened in my real world example?
I haven't personally done research, but it is part of the purview of research known as ecological psychology, where they try to look at the physical environment's impact on our behavior. And there is some research to support exactly what you're suggesting, that certain environment settings create affordances for various motivations. And again, just to get into some jargon here, so I can want something, but it's also the case that our situations create opportunities for wants. In other words, a desk that's a certain height allows me to satisfy some motivations, but not others. So it allows me to have Zoom conversations, but it does not allow me to have to sit down and write. And so on encountering this particular situation, this particular set of affordances, right, this tells my mind, this is what's capable right now. And because writing is not in that, within that purview, it doesn't even come to mind. A similar situation can come up whenever you see indulgences. So indulgences, like, you know, I like to eat. So like my favorite foods are indulgences, not just for my, you know, eat good food motivations, but they're also indulgences they're also affordances for my eat healthy. In other words, by saying no to the affordance, I am now able to express my eat healthy motivations. But what you'll notice here is that the same thing has multiple affordances, and we have to be in the right mindset to see the affordances. So sometimes when we really want something, like if we really, really want to eat, we see affordances that are not that strong, but they're there. But if we're not as hungry, we only see the very strong. And so the solution to your situation is an interaction between the situation, the desk, and your motivation. Because you had a strong enough motivation, you are now making decisions about changing your environment. So it's really a dynamic interaction between the two.
Right. But in my case, I stumbled into it. I did not. So my question to you is there a way you have that the fact that I wasn't writing, I could not go and diagnose why I stopped writing, right? I was trying to, because until you figure out what is preventing you from doing something, can you overcome it? Or is that important to find out what is blocking you to overcome it?
Of course. I mean, anytime anyone encounters the kind of decision problem that you're facing, we first have to ask, what's the source? Now, how do you do that? Again, in my work, we would say that this is another advantage of taking a step back and seeing things in the big picture. Again, we tend to live our lives in the immersed, and living your life fully immersed has its benefits. It makes you sensitive to the opportunities in your environment, which can be really important for exploiting opportunities, right? So if you don't notice opportunities, then you can't exploit them. But if you are sensitive to every opportunity, you may not be sensitive to the things that are most important to you, right? So you're always chasing the shiny object in our environment, and that could actually be a really good thing, but sometimes it can be a bad thing. And so my research talks about the importance of being immersed, but also the importance of taking a step back and really sort of seeing the big picture. And I think one of the things that you're sort of highlighting here is that I'm immersed. I know this is problematic, but I can't see how it's a problem until I take a step back and ask, you know, and sort of think about the broader picture.
I think we're coming a full circle here, because before we started this call, we were talking a little bit about being mindful and being present. So technically, had I been more present to the discomfort in my arms or typing at a level of my chest, had I been more present to that, I might have probably come to this conclusion a lot sooner than just merely stumbling into it.
Mindfulness is a really interesting question. And you're actually pointing out, you're actually highlighting I think what is somewhat controversial in the literature. And I think it comes partly as a result of people not actually understanding what mindfulness is. There is some debate about what it is and whether it's good or bad for certain things. And I don't know the literature well enough to get into it, but I know from my own experiences that I think what mindfulness does is that it breaks the immersion. So it's ironic, by becoming more fully immersed in the situation, I actually break from the story that I was telling, right? So when we say immersion, we don't mean that you get more into the story that's in your head. When you become immersed mindfully, you actually kind of pause the narrative, the chatter that's running in your head, and you start creating new meanings, right? And that are different from the sort of the inertia that you had before. And I think that break, at least this is an idea that I've been playing with, it is actually very similar to the distancing that we have when we, for example, take someone else's perspective, or when we think about ourselves from the third person perspective, right? It's not the story that we were saying. We've paused that. And by pausing, we all of a sudden start noticing other things. It's sort of like, you know, if you're running really fast through a room, you're not going to see anything. Correct. But if you stop, all of a sudden things, and you start noticing things that you never saw before. You can actually start making different decisions. So I actually think that's what mindfulness does, and I think it actually brings us full circle twice over, because I think it actually presents this distance idea. But what's paradoxical and counterintuitive to people is I get to distance through greater immersion, which sounds crazy and wild, but if you actually understand mindfulness, it actually makes a lot of sense.
That's fabulous because, see, so in fact, I use the phrase mindfulness is really about paying attention, right, in a certain way. So when you start paying attention, so for example, in the past, I would never pay attention to my body while talking to someone. Today, thanks to years of mindfulness practice, I know when my hand tenses up. I know when my mouth goes dry. All these are signals to me telling me something is going on. Either I'm nervous, I care too much, or whatever. Especially, I can see, I recently gave a keynote, not recently, pre-COVID, to 350 people. That was the largest audience I spoke to. And you get on stage and the lights come on, you barely can see anyone, and your mouth starts to go dry. And so I knew that was going to happen because I've had it happen before. So I had water available so that I could. At the same time, I predicted it would happen, prepared for it, and was able to deal with it and not just swallow my words.
Exactly, or react to the situation. You're able to be more proactive as opposed to reactive. And again, I think that's really important. I think when we think about self-control, again, I think we think, oh, I'm feeling something I shouldn't. I'm going to hold myself back, and I need to be tough. I need to be strong. And again, I think this is the wrong metaphor. Rather than thinking of myself as restraining myself, I like to think of good self-control as opening up new opportunities, right? I'm going to create new paths as opposed to prevent myself from going down the wrong path. By creating more good paths, I'm more likely to make the decisions that I want to be making.
Interesting. Very interesting. I don't know if you had come across the gentleman Marshall Rosenberg's work in nonviolent communication. He passed away a couple of years ago. Really cool man. And his whole thesis was if you meet the other person needs, then the violence comes down, even in your conversation. And he was able to bridge tribes in Africa that were killing each other purely through this conversation technique, nonviolent communication, and fundamentally trying to get to understand the needs of the other party. And that's his work. But the statement I remember, and I use it all the time, is he's to say, how do you do a don't? Which means many of us write instructions to ourselves saying, don't do this. And so once I heard him say, how do you do a don't? I always write now anything I want to do, whether it's an affirmation or an action or even a to do, in a active what I can do, which means it gives me the agency to execute, right? As opposed to doing a don't.
That's very interesting because it's related to some classic research that was in motivation that was done way back in the day, where they were trying to understand the distinction in psychology between approach and avoidance motivation, right? So you either you have mice and they either approach the cheese or they avoid the electric shock. And what they noticed is that when mice are approaching the cheese, right, they know exactly what they need to do. And you open up that door and they're sprinting down the hallway to get to the cheese. But if you have an electric shock plate and you put them in there, the first thing that the rat does is it freezes, because there's no clear path about what to do. The only path that you know is to get as far away from the situation as possible. But how far, you never actually know. And which direction, you don't actually know. And so what they actually show is that the rats will go in crazy random directions, and they never know when they can be vigilant. So they're always anxious. Far enough away is never enough, right? Whereas when you approach a goal, you know exactly where you need to go. And when you get there, you're there. And so that has led to a lot of psychologists to make the argument that having these more do motivations are better than the do not motivations. There is some controversy. I think it depends on the kind of person you are. So if you are someone who is more anxious, having a don't might be better than a do. Like, you shouldn't do that might be more motivating than that you want to do this. But there might be trade-offs. So I
Oh,
think
yes.
the don't works in the short term, but it completely fails, I think, in the long term. Whereas
That
the do might not do anything in the short term, but does things in the long term.
very interesting. Two things. You said approach, and what was the other word, Ken?
Approach and avoidance.
Approach and well, that mimics aligns closely with the pig and the ape, right? Pursue
Yes,
gratification and avoid painful experiences. One is approach and one is avoidance.
yes,
And
indeed. And,
it's
and
go ahead.
oh, I'm sorry. So I think a lot of people think of self-control as don't eat the chocolate cake, right? As opposed to, become healthier, right? So if you think about approaching becoming healthier, there are lots of ways to do that.
Mhm.
But there's only one way to not eat chocolate cake. And so another aspect, I think, of understanding the self-control situation is to not think of it as restraint, but think of it as an opportunity to do what you really want to do.
That's a very good, healthy approach to look at. In fact, even with one of the things you were alluding to was don't works in the short term because it's fear based, right? And I always use the phrase if fear works, but it's like putting bad fuel in your car. Your
Mm-hmm.
car will run, but it'll gum up your engine over time.
Agreed. And that's also similar to, for example, some people try to engage in self-control via abstinence,
Hmm.
right? Versus a strategy of moderation. And this is something that my students and it's a problem that my students and I are interested in is why people choose abstinence, why people choose moderation. And there are trade-offs, right?
Mhm.
So abstinence guarantees you success in the short term if you can hold on. The problem is holding on is really hard. But in the long term, balancing would be better, doing a little bit of both because you meet both motivations, but it's really hard to figure out how much is too much.
That's you brought about the final word, which is regulation, right? Appropriate regulation. And I wanted to kind of maybe tie it down to something that we have witnessed. I mean, the classic from systems thinking is the bathtub, right? We go open the hot water and then we can't wait for the delay. So we open it some more and then we get scalded and then we shut it down and it gets too cold and we can't really give time for that delay for it to take. You kind of finally figure it out in your home, but when you go to a hotel, depending on the floor you are, it might take different length of time for the hot water to reach you. And so many times you get scalded in a hotel room because you
Indeed.
open and the hot water too much. And these are things that always come to bite us, but because we just want immediate action, right? We can't deal with systems that take time to act.
It's also more complicated, right? So and so that's one of the trade-offs we talk about. Abstinence is very difficult to implement long term,
Yes.
but it makes the calculation of what the right thing to do very easy. So if you tell yourself you can't smoke, what the right answer is very easy to figure out, but it's really hard to implement.
Hmm.
Whereas balancing, like I'll let myself smoke on some occasions, but not others,
Hmm.
figuring out whether this is the right time to smoke or not is incredibly difficult. But
Hmm.
if you could actually solve that problem, you could actually have your cake and eat it too, so to speak,
That's
literally.
very interesting, and something that is up front and center is really about how we handle the COVID situation, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, masking would have regulated certain things as opposed to lockdown. I think humans, we kind of been, it's invisible, we ignore it. And then we come down, much like opening the hot water all the way, right? Because we don't get hot water right away. So lockdown is not necessarily the right answer because then you're just swinging from pendulum open up to lockdown rather than masking would have kind of solved a lot of our problems and maybe even avoided lockdowns. What is that something you guys have looked at or?
We are interested in COVID decisions. We have been thinking about lockdown in the sense of we are interested in thinking about lockdown as an abstinence strategy, as you've made a link.
Mhm.
Our other one is not necessarily the masking, but we've just sort of contrasted it with someone who isn't under complete lockdown, but does interact with their small bubble of friends, right? And so how much risk am I willing to take on differs by people. And that seems to be, we think of that as more of the balancing option. So we're not contrasting lockdown versus masking, but we're sort of saying, taking zero risks versus opening oneself up to a couple of risks. And we haven't done those studies yet, but we are planning to try to see whether people who prefer abstinence also prefer lockdown, whether people prefer balancing, we prefer the sort of balancing risk mitigation type strategy. That's the future directions that we'd really like to go
I'd
into.
be very interested in what you folks come up with, because I think it's here to stay, right? The variants and everything else. So how does life, we call it the new normal. What is
Yeah.
that, right? What is the new normal? I think you guys are touching some of those questions, which is because social isolation and, I pick on words, Ken. I felt that the choice of social distancing was absolutely the wrong decision.
Agreed.
Should have called it physical distancing
Agreed.
and social proximity, because at this time when people are nervous, anxious, you want support as opposed to be isolated.
Agreed.
And I couldn't imagine that even today. I see some places where it says physical distancing, but by and large it is social distancing.
I completely agree. And I thought it was a serious policy misstep or a communication misstep to call it social distancing.
Got it. So we were thinking alike on that one. So again, I really, really want to thank you for this wonderful conversation as usual. And I'm sorry that we have spent a lot of time without communicating, but hopefully as things open up and there's more vaccinations and also people figure out what is the level of risk, as you said, we can take, and what are the precautions to take, and what are the conditions under which we can interact. I'm hoping to see you in person as well.
Agreed. It would be great.
Thank you again, Ken. And
Thank
I hope
you.
this will be quite useful to some people at least.
Hopefully.
Thanks again. Thanks for reconnecting.
And thank you too. Thank you.
Take care. Bye. This is Krishna Pendyala wishing you all well and reminding you to always be open to new perspectives. Take care.